Welcome everyone to today's webinar. We're going to go ahead and get started. I am Stan Cross, and I am honored to serve as the Electric Transportation Policy Director at the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Since 1985, SACE has promoted responsible and equitable energy choices to ensure clean, safe, and healthy communities throughout the Southeast. We are very grateful to partner with EVHybridNoire to advance equitable electric mobility here in North Carolina and beyond. Thanks to the generous support of the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation, SACE and EVHybridNoire are engaged in a 5-year effort here in North Carolina to expand stakeholder participation in electric transportation planning, policymaking, and program implementation, including engaging historically underrepresented communities. As part of this work, EVHybridNoire has focused on understanding Black and Hispanic communities' experiences and attitudes toward mobility and electric vehicles. As electric transportation planning and program implementation ramps up here across North Carolina, and as more electric cars, trucks, and buses hit the road every day, we recognize the importance of this research and ongoing engagement with populations that have been historically excluded but stand to gain much from increasing awareness and accelerating EV adoption in their communities. But we're excited to share findings and insights with you today. Before I turn things over to the EVHybridNoire team, I want to take care of some housekeeping. So number one, today's webinar is being recorded and will be available for distribution. Number two, EVHybridNoire's presentation will last approximately 30 minutes, after which we will field participant questions. Number three, please enter your questions into the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. The SACE team will be monitoring that function, and we'll get to those questions on the back end of EVHybridNoire's presentation. Number four, if we cannot answer all questions during the allotted time, we will provide answers in a follow-up email. So without further ado, let me now welcome EVHybridNoire's co-founder, Dr. Shelley Francis. Shelley is an established national thought leader. She and her team are exposing challenges and identifying solutions to rapidly advance equitable electric mobility. It's an honor to partner with Shelley and her team. And Shelley, thank you and the rest of the EVHybridNoire staff for being with us today. Please take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Stan. And thank you everyone for joining us this morning. We're extremely excited to be here with you today to share findings from this unique and first of its kind research study that examined African-American and Hispanic residents of North Carolina's attitudes, experiences, and knowledge towards electrification and mobility and electric vehicles. So I want to make sure that we acknowledge the partners and the individuals that participated in this study, because of course, without their input and feedback, we wouldn't be here today having this conversation. So let's go ahead and move forward. So on to the study. So we can move forward, just acknowledging our speakers today, but just to give you a quick high-level overview, we have a really wonderful and unique partnership with the SACE team. And so the purpose of the study was to really look at convening key stakeholders, particularly those key stakeholders that weren't often engaged in this conversation around electrification and diversity, equity, and inclusion. So one of the things that we worked on is, grassroots constituency engagement, stakeholder engagement, convening these key stakeholders in a statewide coalition and collaborative to exchange ideas and talk about barriers as well as opportunities. And that way we were ultimately able to continue to maximize opportunities to advance electrification in a way that's accessible and available to all communities by understanding what their unique barriers and perspectives are. So moving on. So for us, e-mobility is more than just getting from points one to A and B. Our organization works to accelerate EV adoption, but we have to increase awareness about that particular topic before we can begin to tailor approaches to meet different communities. So we really want to ensure that this technology is available and accessible to frontline communities, particularly those who are impacted worse and first by overexposure to transportation emissions. And so we believe that the world will be better, the transportation and mobility system will be better if we understand what the specific nuances and challenges are for various communities, so that we can make sure our approaches to engagement, outreach, research, policy, and practice are tailored to their specific needs. So let's go on. So our organization is an advocacy membership organization represented by these different chapters around the country. So we have thousands of members made up of African-American and Latinx or Hispanic community members who are EV enthusiasts and advocates. Our organization spans beyond the United States. So we have global members in Canada, Central America, the Caribbean, Africa, Asia, Europe as well. So we are leveraging their collective voice to really make sure that we're moving this policy forward. And we're also working with the Global EV Alliance as one of the co-founders of this entity that's made up of about 40 electric vehicle associations across the globe who are collectively working to move electrification best practice forward. So this is just a sample of some of the members. And so we'll go on to the next slide. And so when we think about mobility and transportation and diversity, equity, inclusion, it's really more than just getting from, the doctor to work. Transportation really, sets the tone and sets the pace for your economic mobility and trajectory. So moving forward. And so in thinking about transportation and mobility, it's very difficult to have this conversation without thinking about discrimination, equity, and how destructive policies have really shaped what we see today in terms of the landscape around electrification and who's disproportionately impacted and affected by overexposure to pollution. So this is an example of redlining in Durham. This is a map from the 1940s. And for those, just a high level set is, redlining was a predatory practice that the federal government, and banks pursued during the 1920s all the way up into the 50s. And so essentially they deemed certain neighborhoods as being highly qualified for loans, while other neighborhoods were not desirable, and they divested funding from those communities. And typically when you divest funding, then obviously the local equity in the community goes down. So those populations that were typically impacted by redlining were African-American, Black, other multicultural groups, individuals who identified as Jewish, and more. So those are just some of the things to think about when you're thinking about the mobility and transportation context. You have to think about how some of these destructive policies and practices impact what we see in mobility access today. So moving on. So again, this is just highlighting how some of the destructive policies that I talked about from a historical context, and there are many others that we won't have time to get into in this context, but this is the impact that we see today on BIPOC or communities of color. So African Americans are much more likely to live in communities that are considered fence line or disproportionately impacted by air pollution, where African American communities are impacted or exposed to more pollution than they create. And you can see obviously rates of asthma. African American kids are more than 9 times more likely to die from asthma than their non-African American peers. So you can see how these policies have really impacted different communities, and that we see similar trends for tribal and indigenous, as well as Hispanic communities. So moving on. And again, here we look at how transportation availability in terms of personal vehicles within the household skew across various income strata by different metropolitan areas. So as you can see here, there's low income or lower income communities are more likely to not have access to a personal vehicle, whereas the opposite is true as you go into middle and higher income communities. So go ahead to the next one. And so I'm going to turn this over to my colleagues, Alexis Bloomfest, and as well as Brittany Hennett, who will talk about the research approach, as well as provide you with what you really want to hear today is the results of our qualitative and quantitative analysis. So Alexis, I'll hand things over to you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. As Dr. Francis so helpfully outlined, we will be going into the findings. I am the manager of data and research for the organization, so I'm very excited to be here and talk about this really impactful work. So we can go ahead. So a lot of the things that Dr. Francis just brought up are key contextual parts of this conversation and a lot of the reasons why we found the things that we found. And I made this cover page to just at a high level go over the research areas that we studied and kind of what were those key findings. So COVID and transportation, the key finding that we found is that the pandemic shifted transportation behaviors and already communities who were vulnerable now are doubly vulnerable because of the pandemic and its influence. And that also the demographics shape disparities in EV access and ownership. And then we also found some really innovative things on where diverse communities go for trusted information. So the work that EVHybridNoire does is innovative because the level of granularity that we're able to examine these factors and questions with, and the equity-based methodologies that we use to produce the following results. So next slide. So at a high level, I just wanted to go over what our sample population looked like. So our sample population was low income women under 30 predominantly. We studied 283 all Black participants for the quantitative piece. And I really wanted to highlight kind of why this work stands out from so much of what we know about the space. So a study conducted by Morgan State University took a look at 1,300 EV drivers in Maryland and tried to examine, what are the factors that this group of EV owners shares. And they found that the percentage of EV owners were overwhelmingly male, 75%, overwhelmingly white, 85%, and overwhelmingly high income earners making over $100,000, 80%. So that's quite a difference to the group that we're about to look at and the things that we found. Next slide. So as I sort of hinted at, we wanted to first take a look at COVID-19 and transportation. So when we look at how transportation modes have changed across income groups before and after COVID, it really allows us to have a better idea and indications of the pandemic's burden and how these things have been shared or maybe not shared across all the demographic groups. So the first thing to note is that personal vehicle use was the predominant mode of transportation for all income groups before and since the pandemic. But the rate at which participants were able to use or engage with that mode of transportation was not the same across income groups. So we see a 13% difference between low income participants and high income participants that said that they used their car before COVID. And then after COVID, so in this right-hand column, that difference jumped to 17%. So what that tells us is that there are groups of people who, when things and their transportation options change, they're able to consolidate and fall back on reliable transportation. Next slide. So public transportation, there's a lot of great stuff we'll get in here on the qualitative side. And this data really on the quantitative side corroborates what we found, which is that public transportation is not a widely used form of transportation in the community for a lot of reasons, which we'll talk about. But those that do use the service tend to be lower income participants. So again, when we talk about the impact of the pandemic and bus schedules maybe changing or buses being taken off lines or limits to the amount of passengers that were allowed to be on the bus, this is the group that it hurts the most. All right, next slide. And then I want to also take a look at Rideshare because it presents a really, really interesting case. So both before and after the pandemic, the highest share of participants that used rideshare as a daily mode of transportation were middle income participants. But the only group to actually grow in the use of the service since the pandemic was low income participants. So here on the left side, you see 9% of low income participants reported using it as a daily mode of transportation before the pandemic, 10% reported using it as a daily mode of transportation since the pandemic. So what that really tells us is that groups with higher income, as I said, can switch to other modes of transportation, like their own cars, that are less impacted by the pandemic. And they can do so more reliably than lower income groups. And also that the burden of higher transportation costs is exacerbated by the reliance on private transportation services like rideshare. And we also found, to just kind of highlight this point, when we took a look at the participants that said that they use rideshare as a daily transportation mode by education, we found that over half of the participants that use the service every day had high school education, compared to just 7% with a doctorate degree. So that's, again, a really stark disparity in the demographic access to these forms of transportation. Next slide. So this slide really goes into another innovative and proprietary methodology known as profile testing that EVHybridNoire has developed to identify how transportation behaviors vary across a variety of the demographics. So the first thing here in this bar graph that I wanted to point out is that the difference in transportation use and daily transportation use between men and women of the same income groups, women use the service more until we get to the high income group. And then we see, that line start to flatten out. And this kind of data is really important because when we think of what determines access, what determines accessibility, it's not just, one demographic factor or the other. A lot of times it's a combination of them. So then on the right, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the profile testing kind of looks like when we, aim to answer these big questions. So who was using the service on a regular basis before the pandemic? And the alignment of characteristics that were statistically most likely to do that behavior were women under 30 with incomes between $50,000 and $99,000 a year, and some professional education. And over half of the people that matched this profile said that they use rideshare 3 times a week or more. And just for comparison, the general population of the sample group, only 10% of people said that they use the service that often. So then we see, okay, we can start to get an idea of the way that gender and age and education and income interact to produce those sort of stark differences that we see. Next slide. So EV ownership, this is another equity-based variable that we work with. And what this graphic is showing everyone is how EV ownership was represented in the sample population. So 7% of people that we studied were EV owners. The most of them were EV neutral. So what that means is they responded, I've never really heard of EVs. I've never really thought about purchasing one, or, I'm kind of familiar with the concept, but I would need education and more information before I would consider it for a vehicle. And just some key findings that we pulled out when we kind of take a look at this from the demographic standpoint. So we had 4 times as many high income participants report being EV owners compared to low income participants. So again, the demographic divide among EV ownership is especially stark along income lines, even in all Black communities, like we studied. But the community or the income group that was least likely to say, hey, I don't need a vehicle, I'm not looking to buy one, was actually middle income participants, where just 3% said, I'm not in the market for a car. And then also women are statistically more likely than men to be EV owners. And what that really tells us is that That's a big narrative shift from what we know about this technology, where men are technically thought of as, the early adopter groups. Next slide. And then just another example of a demographic that impacts access. And this one is charging access. A big part of what we see is that if you can't charge at home, 80 to 90% of charging takes place at home. If you can't charge your vehicle at home, there's not going to be a lot of impetus for you to want to, change over to a different kind of vehicle. And what we see is that older groups in particular, over 3/4 of them said, I don't have charging access, compared to participants that are, under 30, where the rate of participants saying they have charging access or saying they didn't have charging access was much lower. Next slide. And this finding in particular highlights some of the crucial foundations of EVHybridNoire's work. So as I said in the previous slide, we see EV ownership as a variable with the share participants that were in each category under each icon. And then what we also see is the share participants that reported home charging access. And what the first thing to kind of pick out here is that the light blue in each of the circles gets smaller the further away you get from EV ownership, almost in a linear drop off. And it also shows us the overrepresentation of home charging access was really a small part of the study population. So 7% of EV owners said they could charge at home, or 7% of the population that we studied were EV owners, but 80% could charge at home. So that's a very stark difference in how we think about charging access in the proximity to the technology itself. Next slide. So this is one last example I wanted to show of the profile testing, again, just to kind of show how these demographics are really, really important to understanding these big questions. So here we see on the green box on the left, the alignment of characteristics that were most likely to say, I don't need a vehicle. And we found it was women between 51 and 70 making under $50,000 with a high school education. And 57% of people with these characteristics said they don't need a car. And then in the general population, so if we don't look at demographics, only 14% of people in the study said that they didn't need a car. So again, a really big gap there in the share of participants answering the same thing. And the reason why are these demographic traits that we see. And then on the other side, so this is also like kind of how we think. So what makes someone move from, being in the no vehicle need group to the low EV awareness group? So the alignment of characteristics that were most likely to fall in this group were the same, except the level of educational attainment was a little bit higher. So some professional education. These people have a 2-year degree, or maybe they've gone to trade school. And then what we found is that 3/4 of people that matched this profile had low EV awareness, compared to just 1/4 in the general population. Next slide. So these are the last things I'm just gonna go over. And this is where people trust to get their information and how we can engage with diverse communities. And this is really important because if you put information where people are not at, then they will never learn that information. So EVHybridNoire's findings, what we see here, we ask participants, who would you trust to go do for information around EVs? And each percentage under the icons shows the percentage of people in each of the groups that said they would trust that source. So what our findings suggest is that family and friends are important sources of information for those already tapped into the EV ecosystem. So over half of EV owners and almost half of EV intenders said that they would trust their family and friends to go to for information around EVs. And then on the charging side, almost 1/3 of participants with home and community charging access said the same. These findings indicate that it's very likely that these participants know people in their close circles with EV experience. So what that means, like from policy and action perspective-wise, is that we need to increase the reach of high-quality information into personal circles and offer opportunities for more intra-community engagement to make sure that people with these high-quality information sources are also reaching those who maybe don't have the same. For example, the low EV awareness group, we see just 10% of people said they would trust their family and friends around electric vehicle information. Next slide. The other group that we looked at as a source of information was also dealerships. And then kind of conversely, we found that those who didn't trust or didn't have high quality information in their close circles tended to trust car dealerships for information around the technology. And those who preferred dealerships were those with no charging access, low EV awareness, and no personal vehicle use or need. And what that really tells us is that, from a policy perspective, action standpoint, we really need to be doing intentional outreach to dealerships so that when people come, after looking for information, they're met with staff who are informed and prepared to answer their questions and address their doubts about electrification. Next slide. And then last one, on my end, the internet, this is also really kind of foundational findings. Again, those without access to high quality information tend to go to the internet to find information around EVs. And kind of the catch all here is that the internet is filled with misconceptions, and it's not easy to influence the quality of information that people are being exposed to. So what we're kind of hypothesizing and what we can study as next step kind of questions is the correlation between those who have this like internet as a trusted source of information and misinformation around EVs, because what we postulate is that it's higher among these groups because of the fact that the quality of information and the access are not the same when you get further from the technology. So in conclusion, engagement strategies that focus on the internet have a big opportunity to meet people where they are while also increasing access to high quality information. But that's if we understand and know how to intentionally develop engagement strategies. So I will then with that pass it on to Brittany.
Hi everyone, my name is Brittany Hennett and I'm a research analyst with EVHybridNoire, and I'll be going over the key qualitative findings from the RDE report. The main three findings that we found were over-reliance on personal transportation, communal transportation systems, and community engagement. Next slide, please. Starting with over-reliance on personal transportation, a quote from a key informant interview states that residents tend to own their own cars, or they tend to ride with a friend or a family member, but I don't know that many people actually looking for public transportation or other methods. Next slide. This is important because we can see that there are various key factors that result in overdependence on personal transportation. This can be geographic landscapes, greater driving distances, lack of transportation options, and the rural and urban divide. Next slide, please. Moving to our second main finding, in communal systems in Hispanic communities, reasons for increased carpooling in these communities are due to higher commuting cost burdens, living in a vehicle shortage household, lacking adequate access to public transportation. And as we can see from a key informant interview, this is a quote directly from our research, the Hispanic community is very supportive of each other. We see many times that residents take rides from other friends or neighbors so that they can come across to our services. Next slide, please. For example, people who live in food deserts have to at least walk a mile to the closest bus stop to hop on public transportation just to access food. Next slide, please. Some more key context on public transportation is that, it's not optimized largely due to the fact that more than 80% of the people in the Raleigh-Durham area never use the public transportation. And we can also see that residents need better access to public transportation. Currently, 86% of people in the area who don't use public transportation as a daily transit option will never use the service. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges of using public transportation in this area? Firstly, we can see that having reliable transportation is an economic necessity, and having transportation in a timely manner is what's very important. Secondly, services that are in English can be challenging for non-native/fluent speakers. Therefore, providing services in Spanish can ultimately increase knowledge and awareness surrounding public transportation. And thirdly, there is a negative community perception of public transportation. So what can we do to change this? Next slide, please. Some key findings that we found from our participants were that the perceptions that we found interesting, since I won't go over all of them, is that charging is inaccessible, complicated, and expensive. It's distant from the Hispanic community. And lastly, that there are people are ultimately aware of the environmental benefits that electric vehicles have. Next slide, please. So starting with the who matters? The messenger matters. Participants stress that they want to receive information from sources that are trusted, linguistically relevant, and culturally sensitive. This also means that working with organizations that are reflective of their communities. Next slide, please. Moving on to the what. So how do we understand these community gaps? And the major theme that we saw from participants that they wanted to learn about was cost. This can include battery, maintenance costs, charging costs, and long-term saving costs. Next slide, please. So where can we meet residents? We need to meet residents where they are. And we can meet people where they are, but we also have to acknowledge that all the people may not know the information, but they can all start somewhere. So some of the key places that we can meet them are through printed materials, social medias, or community events. Next slide, please. So why are we building this community awareness? Participants in both research groups shared that community awareness currently is lagging in early adopters, which requires more targeted outreach and education efforts to close this gap. Next slide, please. Lastly is the how. So how do we implement linguistic representation? Participants emphasize, especially in the key informant interviews, that we need to communicate things in Spanish and English when it comes to any type of engagement strategy. Furthermore, when you want to have a linguistic representation, you are ultimately building trust within participants, which is what EVHybridNoire wants to do. Next slide, please. Lastly, to wrap up our work, EVHybridNoire stresses the importance in communicating and allowing participants to share their experiences with us and uses feedback to shape our work. We can see that a majority of participants rated their group experiences as excellent and would recommend their work in the research to their family and friends. And 92% of people said that they learned new information about electric vehicles, which is very, very important in our work. Next slide, please. So how does our research impact in words? We can see that participants provided feedback not only in English, but also Spanish, showing that there is linguistic trust between us. And participants were comfortable and liked the structure of our interviews and focus groups, and that they felt that interviewers took the time to address their concerns and limited knowledges about electric vehicles. And that concludes my part, and I will wrap it up to Dr. Francis to finish the presentation.
Thank you so much, Brittany and Alexis. So one of the key takeaways from this work and how we kind of move and operate in the space is that it's really critically important to engage and listen and learn from the communities that we are, targeting and that we know are not engaged at the level that we would like them to be. So when we say we're engaging with communities and we're building relationships, we always say that things will move at the speed of trust. So you really have to make sure that you're being intentional and building relationships and not just kind of helicoptering into communities and then helicoptering out with the information that you might need for whatever initiative or RFP or process. It's really important to set these intentional, authentic relationships. So you have to do the work to get to that point. And we're just very fortunate and thankful that we were able to engage with the different partners representing all these different communities and perspectives to be able to hopefully move the electrification needle further. So we can move on to the next slide. And of course, we have to plug the conference that's coming up. So if you are interested in hearing more about the different topics that we discussed, please join us October 13th to the 14th for our virtual annual conference. It's National E-Mobility, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Conference. And we'll be talking about many of these issues, but also from a multimodal electrification perspective. So whether you're working in the utility space or fleet electrification or heavily focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion and partner and stakeholder engagement, there's going to be a panel and numerous speakers that are going to be geared directly to possibly some of the issues that you are grappling with in your work to accelerate electrification. So definitely stay tuned for that, and we'll move on to the next topic. And again, obviously, we'd like to thank SACE as well as our funder for being able to facilitate this type of work. Thank you to the EVHybridNoire team who all worked together to make sure that this was an informative but also attractive presentation for you. So thank you to the team for that, and we can move on here. So we're ready now to transition into the question and answer portion of the webinar process.
Great. Well, thank you, Shelley and Alexis and Brittany. That was a fantastic presentation. Really appreciate you taking us deep into the data. So we have some great questions coming in from participants here. So I will start to field those questions. First off, just to kind of address the question of the scope of the quantitative research, it was focused on the greater Raleigh-Durham area and had 283 participants. And so kind of building off of that, we've got some questions about if the folks who were participating in the survey were mostly urban, and if so, kind of how you see that influencing some of the results around transit use, rideshare use, et cetera.
Yeah, so I can go ahead and take this one. So we actually had a pretty diverse set of participants from across the state. And another presentation had done about this work. I had a slide that showed where most of the participants were by congressional district. So I think we had a lot of participants coming from districts 12 and 6. So we had some concentration in some areas, but we definitely had a geographic spread that kind of allowed us, because as we see in other work that we've done, where we do this work also plays a part, and where we are able to engage with participants, if they're in a rural landscape or an urban landscape or a suburban landscape, all of that is really important. And kind of what we've looked at also, a big part of research is we constantly want to reevaluate our work and improve. And some of the things that we've been doing is increasing the scope of the demographic questions that we ask, because as you see in the work that we did, we had in the presentation, these demographics go very, very far and answering a lot of the things that we see in charging access. And in this particular study, one of the demographics we did not study geographic type as a demographic question, but I think, to look into, what can we answer next? Obviously, as you heard, this is a multi-phase project. I think that's a great consideration, because as you saw, the geography and the geographic landscape of the state actually did impact the findings we saw, especially with the qualitative work, with the fact that drivers in North Carolina drive more than the US average and the US median, just because things are more spread out. And when things are more spread out, it's harder to have a public transportation system that can flow seamlessly between an urban area and a rural area. So then you have also a lot of drop off in the services. So there's obviously challenges that the landscape presents. And now, having done this research, I think it's definitely a question that we need to put a tab in for the next phases of our work, to kind of get deeper into what exactly those impacts are.
Great, thanks, Alexis. Another question came in about sort of the EV ownership and what that equates to. And when we were looking at participants who are EV owners, did you see a relationship between those folks being sort of the primary driver? In other words, like, did those households have another car that was also an internal combustion engine? How do you see that play out with participants?
Yeah, so that's another great question. I've been tracking the Q&A as they come in. And that's another one. So as I talked about, we're expanding our demographics and trying to play with what are the questions that we need to ask, what are the questions that we should ask, and what are the questions that you can and can't ask. So for example, one of the things that from an equity standpoint and research that we see people do wrong all the time is they combine race and ethnicity as one question. What is your race / ethnicity? But race and ethnicity are separate variables. And that's really important because that will obviously impact the things that you find. We currently in our survey don't have a question about how many cars are in the household. I think that's another thing that would be definitely great for us to bookmark and come back to, because findings just generally in space, there's definitely households where there's maybe a combustion engine vehicle and an EV under the same roof. Or maybe, there's a family who are people who maybe have a car that they use for 6 months and then they don't use it for 6 months because maybe they store it or whatever the case may be. So I think that's another thing that we need to think about as we try to determine what demographics, again, we need to answer and what demographics we need to make sure we ask in the right way. And I also, I saw a question, I kind of wanted to throw this one in there as well, because someone had asked about if the ownership of the house or the types of places that people live impact EV ownership. I'm trying to find the exact one. But the question had just tried to sort of suss out the residential location. Is it going to affect respondents saying that they have no need for a car? So absolutely. And we actually just concluded 2 studies in the Midwest where we included questions on housing type and rentership. And what we actually found there is that there was a very, very significant relationship. So we found that in this landscape in the Midwest, 76% of EV owners owned their home, compared to just 20% of people who said they don't need a car or they don't drive. And that number and sort of that relationship also carries over to the types of homes that people have. So we find that people who rent their homes are statistically significantly more likely to live in apartments, and people that own their homes or own their residence type live in homes. So these variables, home ownership and housing type, are almost the same in that way. And then what we see when we compare it to EV ownership is that there is definitely a very distinct sort of spectrum that we see, kind of the same thing as home charging access. You get into EV intenders, it's pretty much the same. It's 73% own the residence. And then you get to low EV awareness, and only a third do. So definitely something that I think is really important to sort of talk about in this conversation is that where people live and the types of places that they live absolutely has a big impact on their level of familiarity with the technology, and then also how proximate they actually are to it. And I don't want to cut off Brittany and Dr. Francis, so if either of you two want to jump in at any point.
So I had a point that I wanted to touch on. One of the questions focused on, like, why did we think that women were kind of more primed and more engaged in terms of EV ownership? And I would say one of the reasons in this particular example, potentially what we've seen nationwide, is that African-American women are one of the most highly educated groups in the country, and women in general are leading the purchasing decisions for their households. And I think a similar trend is seen within African-American households and with women. So what we've seen in other studies that we facilitated across the country is that African-American women are kind of leading the way in terms of EV adoption. So we've seen some similar patterns with a project. We just released a study with Consumer Reports last week. It's Consumer Reports Us Green Latinas. And I think I'm forgetting somebody, and I apologize to our partner if I forgot you, but essentially, UCS, can't forget UCS. And so essentially that study and a previous study from 2 years ago that was released show that African-American and Hispanic consumers have the highest propensity for EV adoption. And so I think that we're seeing some consistent patterns in this kind of phenomena. And what we know to be true is just having the membership organization, we're leveraging the membership to really normalize EV adoption and kind of spread the word of mouth do the grassroots engagement and outreach to really have people touch, see, and experience EVs and electrification.
So following on that, Shelley, you all did found that friends and family, right, are trusted resources and can really influence both awareness and a decision to purchase EVs. And conversely, if left to the internet, there's a lot of misinformation there that can have the inverse effect. And so given that, do you all, what you're seeing both here in North Carolina and nationwide, have any thoughts on strategies that could be utilized to leverage that friends and family influence and kind of blunt, the misinformation on the internet, particularly when we're talking about raising awareness in communities of color?
Yes, and so just would you just repeat the last part of the question again for me, Stan?
Yeah, when you like strategies that you all are uncovering or seeing others, put into practice that can really leverage that friend and family connection to do more effective outreach in communities of color.
Yes, we actually are seeing that. And so one of the ways that we leverage that is with our membership base. So like the chapters, they're not only doing obviously like advocacy at the state level and the local, federal level to get more EV friendly policies in place, but they're doing things, for example, as providing testimony for the EPA or other advisory boards. They are doing things such as, doing education and outreach at multiple stages in life. So K through 12, we have a K through 12 STEM program to really like normalize EVs and show the different career paths that are available. The same audience is also doing National Drive Electric Week events or Drive Electric Earth Day events. EVHybridNoire is one of the 4 national presenting organizers of those events. So there's a great opportunity to, again, like really normalize EV adoption, come out with culturally appropriate and relevant ways to engage different communities. Because what we found is like kind of like that general market approach isn't going to be salient with diverse communities. So, African American communities are diverse. There's not just one group of people, even though we kind of lump folks in buckets, but there should be intentional attention paid to providing culturally appropriate education and outreach or communication messages, whether you're dealing with diverse Hispanic communities or tribal and indigenous populations or African Americans. You can still have a general market message around electrification and engagement strategy, but what we know from research is that you really have to do culturally appropriate engagement efforts to like really tap into and reach diverse communities.
Thanks, Shelley. And in sort of broadening a little bit, we're all working towards advancing electric mobility, but we recognize that single car ownership isn't right for everyone, and the least impactful mile is the one not driven. So how what are you all seeing as far as hurdles in your research to not only electrifying transportation, but also providing better access to transit and other multimodal solutions for communities, particularly communities of color?
I'll let you go first, Alexis, and I can jump in. And Brittany, feel free to add anything else too that you want to share.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, Stan. And I think that's one of the things that we want to emphasize with this work is that there is no one size fits all solution for communities. So, we can't go out and expect that overnight we're going to have communities with, very disproportionate transportation burdens taking on a vehicle as, owning a vehicle overnight. So we have to also, begin to think where and when is this process, like where and when do we, electrify what kinds of transportation. And I think that's another kind of big thing why data-driven research like this is so important, because when we talk about who can we put into an EV overnight with the right incentive program or whatnot, our research says That's Black women with a middle income range in this group. And when we talk about, who needs access to public transportation, well, when we, look at things like whose transportation behaviors were especially impacted by COVID, because I think COVID is a very good benchmark, a very good litmus test for identifying communities with vulnerable transportation needs. So when we think about kind of just in broad terms, I think the very first thing that you need to do is intentionally engage with your community and understand it. And we found in our research that because of this sort of overdependence on personal vehicles, lack of, public transportation, so electrification plans, even if they come into place, might not help those, that need it most because the service itself isn't there. So having an e-bus or a gas bus won't make the schedules better, or it won't make the routes better. So what we saw then is that because these families, they tend to live in a household where it's a grandparent and a parent and a kid and under one roof, and they're sharing the same car. Then you come into a place where you might have to share rides with people, and that's exactly what we found, is that in this particular context among Hispanic communities, there's a high communal sort of relationship with not only the community but with the transportation that they share. So then the idea is, okay, we'll think about next steps. A great kind of program for this community would be a car sharing program, or maybe there's a grant that people apply for. We come in and help, or whatever community-based organization wants to help apply for funds that would be able to maybe purchase cars that would then be donated to a community, and they could be signed out for, whatever time, and people can coordinate rides. And what that also does is we found, and this is in the report that we're going to be releasing, but because of things like institutional barriers. So if you are non-documented in the United States, you can't own a vehicle without putting yourself in a vulnerable position. You cannot get a driver's license without putting yourself in a vulnerable position. So then you have, the additional point of, you need a vehicle in this kind of landscape, but what if you can't drive one? So the answer is not straightforward. And I think my answer kind of shows that because, there's a lot of things that you have to think and put into context to understand what electrified options work where and when and for what communities. And it just shows the importance of really understanding, having a robust grasp on demographics, as I think the point that should really be driven home when we kind of have this conversation.
Yeah, and I will add that I think one of the most basic things that we need to do is do research like this in rural communities and indigenous communities with the ADA communities, to make sure that we are crafting electrification strategies that are truly accessible to all communities, that are based on the feedback that communities are saying in terms of the challenges and the barriers that they're facing, as well as the opportunities. And so having opportunities to do work like this is really, I think, very not only impactful. I'm not saying that because we did it, but I think it definitely is filling a void in the space that exists. So we do a lot of really good work around the policies, providing, we're doing a better job of providing more resources to be able to purchase, multimodal electric vehicles. But we need to also make sure that we are investing in education and outreach so that diverse communities from A to Z understand the benefits of electrification. They're able to connect the dots in terms of the public health benefits, the workforce and economic development opportunities, because we don't just want folks to be consumers. We also want them to be able to tap into the entrepreneurship opportunities in the e-mobility space. We also want them to know that there's career opportunities from all levels of education. So whether you have a GED or whether you have 5 PhDs and an engineering background, there's opportunities really to bring communities along in this conversation. And so I think in addition to putting steel in the ground and patting ourselves on the back for building out infrastructure, if the folks who are needing to access infrastructure and who could benefit the most from this technology aren't dialed in the way we are, for those of us who are steeped in the space, we're still going to have folks at a disadvantage, and we're still going to see the same kind of dismal rates of adoption in many of these communities. And so I also dropped a couple links into the chat. The public policy toolkit provides some really great context as well as best practices around multimodal electrification, particularly dealing with a lot of these issues around DE&I, and also dropped a link to the conference into the chat.
And just to go off what Dr. Francis said, as you know, I did a lot of the qualitative work and worked directly and talked to these people through interviews and focus groups. And so a lot of their feedback was, you know, we're interested in this space and we want to talk more about it, but we don't know how to engage in this space. And I think like providing platform for education and awareness is so important, and it allows them, and we allowed them to ask us questions about, you know, how can we learn more about this? And a lot of them had, a lot of people, if you're not knowledgeable enough about the situation, you're going to be, you know, confused or misinformed. And we were able to, at the end of them, give, you know, our experiences, electrification and electric vehicles and e-mobility. And a lot of these people didn't know that these options existed in the RDU area. And thankfully I do live here. So I was able to tell them like, no, these options are available and this is what we do. And, you know, this is what's, you know, around Raleigh, and, you know, this is what they're doing to increase access. And so just providing that, you know, basic understanding and knowledge can go a really long way.
Yeah. And I just wanted to tell that because there was a question that asked, you know, how, I think this is kind of a good place to also kind of tie all of these knots together. You know, how do we get this high quality information, you know, to people that need it? So we see that, you know, people with EVs in their proximity have family and friends who know about the technology. So, you know, the answer to that, you know, is there's a lot of levels to it, but just to take from what we're doing, not to toot our own horn here at EVHybridNoire, but the membership organization structure that we have is absolutely critical for closing that gap. Because you bring people into the fold, you know, who are interested in the technology, allow them a space to be enthusiastic and get excited about it. And then these are people that go into their communities, and if they tell, you know, 3 of their friends about their vehicle, and that person tells 3 of their friends about, you know, a friend of a friend has this EV and they go to all these meetups and it sounds really fun, you know, that's going degrees of information spread fast, but you got to be able to, you know, give people the place to convene, and then also give them the enthusiasm and resources to bring that information into their communities.
Yeah, well, thank you, Alexis. I think that that's a great place to sort of wrap up for this webinar. I want to let folks know a couple of things. One is that everything that was here on the webinar will be made available. So you'll be able to share these insights with others in your network, and also look back over the presentation to see the data that EVHybridNoire has been unpacking. We have a number of questions that have come in that we've been unable to address in the hour, so we will be answering those questions, and we'll include those answers with our follow-up email. So I just want to thank everybody from the EVHybridNoire team and everyone from the SACE team behind the scenes making this webinar possible. Also like to thank again the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation for their ongoing funding for this work. We're going to be working together, SACE and EVHybridNoire, here in North Carolina for another 3 years, so a lot more to come. So stay tuned, and until then, take care. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.